All right, here it is. Okay, so Michael asks, you recently answered, do we have a spirit, body, and soul without mentioning the word heart? Are the heart and the spirit the same thing? As an example, Jeremiah 17:9, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? Also, it's interesting, at least to me, to note that the word soul appears 498 times in the King James Version, spirit appears 523 times, and heart 884 times. All right, so Tina, what do you think? What does the Bible say? Are spirit and heart the same thing?
Thank you so much for that question. And I
By the
know that
way, I don't know if we are live yet. I'm checking a live stream and it's saying the video hasn't started.
it's saying live to, and it's counting. Oh, it's showing live.
Okay. Well, want to make sure we're live.
Yeah, no, that's a good point.
Okay.
All right. Well, I'll go ahead and answer it. If I answer it again, that's okay. So just to go back to the question, because it was kind of three parts, and it basically said there was a question on Bible Ask that said, "Do we have a spirit, body, and soul?" Without mentioning the word heart. So the first question was, do we is a heart and the spirit the same thing? Is what I understood. And
Mhm.
I would say that the answer to that is no. Biblically speaking, when it comes to the soul, let us look as to what a soul is. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 7, it says, "And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul." So when you become a soul, it's a combination of two things. One is the dust of the ground combining with the breath of life, which is the spirit. And there's other verses you can find to substantiate that. But just to make this point, only when those two things together become one, that's when we become a living soul. And that's what a soul is it's a living being with a body made of the dust and a spirit breathed from God himself. So once those things separate, when we die, the breath returns back to God and the dust returns to the earth, biblically speaking. So a heart is definitely not a soul. But when it comes to your heart, that also is another word for your mind, I would say, when thinking about um, the um, in the spiritual sense of things, because it says, like you're quoting in Jeremiah, the heart is desperately wicked. Who can know it? And the heart, longs for things, but the mind is kind of where you imagine these, wicked thoughts. And so heart and mind are kind of connected in that sense, in that your heart, isn't your brain. It can't think. So the heart and mind, I would say, are more connected than any other thing in the Bible. But that is a good fact that you definitely know your your Bible words and can, they're listed hundreds of times. So again, those are definitely, that shows that those are very important things as part of our walk with God and as part of our salvation.
It's interesting to me that the first time heart shows up in the Bible is when God talks about how, or it says in Genesis 6:5 that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was evil continually, speaking about man before that time. So it says his heart is imagining evil thoughts. So that clearly is not just talking about, a physical organ, but really is, yeah, our consciousness, our thoughts, our mind.
I'd be really interested to know some. We talked about the accounts of these words, but we know that every translation is, is a bit removed from. There's when they do a translation of a word from the original Greek or Hebrew, there's changes that come into place with that because there's some interpretation that has to come in around that word.
Mhm.
Is there anything you want to add as far as some of like the original words and the definitions that go with those?
That's a good point because, like we talked about spirit, did you talk about ruach and nefesh? Like there's two different words for spirit. So each could have a different meaning. With heart, there could be many different words for heart also. And even in the New Testament, you're going to have your own different words there. So it's not going to be exactly the same translation every time you look at different versions of the Bible. So the person asked a question framed it in terms of King James. So that was very, very well thoughtful to do it that way. But what's really interesting with the word heart is actually, I think it's one that's more consistent, right? I think it's the word Caleb. Actually, I could pull it up right now. And here's a good tip. If you are struggling with what are the words in the Bible, the best resource I've found that's free is the Blue Letter Bible, blueletterbible.com. And it has a interlinear option where you can pull up a word and you can see what is it in the original text. It gives you the translation, everything. So heart is, for example, leb. And then there could be other variations of leb. It could be shorter, longer, or lav. And yeah, it does mean heart, mind, midst of understanding, hearted, wisdom, like all sorts of different things.
Exactly. And it's actually funny. I was actually gonna make that same plug because I'm on Blue Letter Bible right now. And
Yeah,
I
love it.
I love that resource just because you can get back to the original Hebrew. And I found so many answers to questions I've had about the Bible, like, why did it say it that way? But then when you look at the original meaning, you're like, oh, okay, you get a clearer picture. And it's definitely something you have to take verse by verse. When you come to a verse and you don't quite understand it, it's always best to go back to the roots because, and just like many other, passages in the Bible. I know when I was studying Daniel, there's a verse for basically a prophecy or a vision, and there's two different words that basically indicate which one he's talking about. And so just like you're saying, when you're looking at the meaning of those words, it's really important, just like you're saying, Jay, to go back to the original language.
So, absolutely. I completely agree on that. We just had it up here. Can you go back into that when you were just on heart?
Phil, maybe you can share the screen. We can show people a little bit about what it looks like with Bible, Blue Letter Bible, and how they can look up the words for themselves. Because we really want to empower people, right? We don't want to even take our word for granted. We want to empower you so that you could go straight to the source. And one thing to talk about too, I think, is in Hebrew, it's a very metaphorical language. They didn't have Sigmund Freud, and they didn't have, the level of science that we do today, and we have a word for everything. So when they're talking about how you're thinking, how you're feeling, and all these things, they're going to probably go with more tangible descriptions. So, heart, your chest, this area, these, where you're feeling things, and that's what they're going to go with.
So what I found interesting in heart here on for Leb on the Blue Letter Bible, it particularly mentions mind, knowledge, thinking, reflection, and memory. And that, I think, is a key distinction from, for instance, spirit. And I think it would be useful if we could pull up spirit as well and look at that here to compare that in this. But it's interesting to me that this specifically talks about memory and reflection and knowledge, which are fairly distinct from
we actually do have spirit here.
Other aspects of the mind. So for spirit, it's talking more about courage and kind of more temperament sorts of things.
Yeah, and I think like where I'm looking it up too, like spirit can mean wind, breath, mind, spirit. So it can mean multiple things, just like going back to the Genesis 2:9 verse, the spirit being the spirit of God, which is like the breath of God.
Right.
It can mean the same thing, but then like in your spirit, which is a different meaning, and I believe it's a different word. It's kind of more like your feeling or your personality and that sort of a thing.
Exactly. So I think key is don't take the Bible necessarily too literally and think there might be these different things when really the Bible might be using different words to discuss overlapping concepts.
Yeah.
And even the way they might demarcate these thoughts and ideas might be differently than how we do today. The word mind and heart might mean very different things to us today, but maybe not so much back then.
Yeah, because I believe the King James Bible was translated in early 1600s. So,
Yeah.
I mean, you think of how many words have changed in the last, 10 years.
Yeah.
When my mom was a kid, the word cool meant it was cold. When I was a kid, it meant, what you wanted to be. So, there's a lot of words like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's another really good key factor to keep in mind, is that language is always changing, like
Yes.
how long ago was groovy a word. We don't really use that anymore. There's so many things like that too.
I still do.
Because you're super groovy.
Yeah,
um
I think that's a really important point, that we associate certain meanings to language based on our current understanding today, but the association that people had for these words at the time this was written is very different, and so we have to be mindful of that when we are reading and coming to understand what the Bible is talking about. Um, we have to, I think it's really helpful to tune it, to look up some of those the original Greek and Hebrew on it. And my husband is Lebanese, and his family speaks Arabic sometimes, and they the hearing their how they describe definitions of some of these words versus how and stories in the Bible versus how I learned it growing up in the U.S. and in the American way. It is very different, and I think it's useful to kind of look at some of these different perspectives and different angles to get to the best understanding of it.
mhm.